The ground was already winning. Einar Voss could feel it through the soles of his boots, a cold that did not creep but pressed, steady and absolute, rising through the frozen earth of the Fortymile River basin like a debt coming due. He had been notching timber for 3 hours. The hand axe in his grip weighed 2 pounds when a man was fresh. It weighed considerably more when a man was not. The blade glanced off a knot in the spruce log and sent a shock up through both wrists that made his back teeth click together. He reset his grip, drove the axe in again, and kept working. It was October 4th, 1897. The temperature at dawn had been 11 degrees below zero. By mid-morning, it had climbed to 4 below, which in the 40-mile country passed for a mild spell. The sky was the color of dirty tin, low and sealed, just the kind of sky that experienced men read the way a doctor reads a pulse. It meant snow. It meant wind behind the snow. It meant whatever a man had not finished building by nightfall would not protect him. Einar had not finished building anything yet. He was 37 years old, a shipwright from Stavanger, Norway, who had read about the Klondike strike in a Bergen newspaper and made the decision in the space of one evening. He had sold his tools, his workshop leased, and his mother's copper cookware, converted everything to American currency, and booked passage to Skagway. His wife Britta had not argued. She had packed their 2 daughters, Hannah, 8 years old, and little Kirsten, who had just turned 5, into wool coats and followed him north without complaint. That was the kind of woman she was, and the kind that did not argue about the decision, only about the execution of it. The execution of it, at this particular moment, was a stack of heavy timbers laid out on the frozen ground in the shape of a letter A that every other man in the 40-mile camp was calling a fool's errand. "Voss!" The voice came from behind him. Einar did not stop swinging. He knew the voice. It belonged to a man named Creed Halvorson, no relation despite the Norwegian name, a Dakota placer miner who had worked 3 seasons in the Cassiar country before coming north. Halvorson was capable and loud, and had spent the better part of 2 days making his opinion known about Einar's construction. "Voss, I am going to ask you one more time to put your family in my tent until you can build something sensible." Einar set the hand axe against the log and reached for his measuring cord. He pulled it taut across the peak timber and checked the angle. "Thank you, Creed. That is not an answer. I know." He drove the axe in again. Halvorson squatted at the edge of the work site, his forearms resting on his knees, his breath coming out in dense white clouds. He was a big man, blocky through the chest, with hands that had the look of something carved rather than grown. He stared at the angled frame with the expression of a man watching a friend make a fatal mistake in slow motion. "Steep sides are fine for snow," he said, for what Einar estimated was the 6th or 7th time. "But you have no mass, no earth around you, and no insulation but a layer of moss and dirt on top. When it hits 40 below in January, and it will hit 40 below, that sod is going to do nothing. You understand? Nothing. The wind will strip the heat out through every gap between those shakes." Einar looked up at him. "You are right that wind is the enemy." Halvorson spread his hands. "Then why?" "Because the wind cannot find what it cannot reach." Einar reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn soft at the creases, covered in pencil figures. He had done these calculations on the riverboat coming north, then again on the trail, then once more by firelight the first night in camp, checking his arithmetic 3 times before he trusted it. Steep sides shed snow rather than holding it. Once that snow packs against the walls and over the roof, the 3 feet of packed snow adds insulation no amount of wood can buy. The A-frame invites that burial. It is designed for it. He tapped the paper. And the pipe, 8 feet of horizontal cast iron before the chimney angles out. That pipe radiates along its full length. Every foot of it gives heat back to the room. Not just the firebox, the whole run. Halvorsen stared at him. Cast iron pipe costs money. Less than a man's family costs him if they freeze. Einar folded the paper and put it back in his coat. Your tent, up on that platform. It sits in -20 air on all sides, above and below. The wind finds every seam. You feed your stove all night, and your feet are still cold in the morning. Halvorsen said nothing, which was not agreement, but was at least the absence of argument. I am not fighting the cold, Einar said. I am redirecting the heat. A man named Rudd Calthorpe, who ran a 2-man operation 40 yards upstream and had wandered over to observe what he privately described to his partner as the Norwegian's architectural delusion, snorted from the tree line. Pretty speech from a man building a tent frame. He was from Missouri, Calthorpe, and had the Missouri habit of treating patience as a character flaw. You got a wife and 2 little girls, Voss. When that sod roof slides off in a January wind and you are standing inside a spruce skeleton at -50, you going to make another pretty speech? Einar picked up the hand axe. Britta was 40 feet away, sorting their supplies with Hannah's help, both of them moving with the brisk, purposeful efficiency that told him she had heard every word and chosen to say nothing. But Kirsten sat on a supply crate with a wool blanket over her shoulders, watching her father work with the calm, total attention that small children give to things they do not yet understand, but instinctively trust. He drove the axe into the notch on the peak timber, seating it flush. He was joining the 2 main rafters at the crown, notched and pegged with a wooden trunnel, no metal nail at the structural joint, the same way he had joined frames in the shipyard. The peg would tighten as the green wood dried. It would hold through anything the Klondike could bring. The frame was designed from what he knew. A-frame construction had been used in Scandinavia for centuries, its steep pitch engineered specifically for heavy snowfall. The sides were wall and roof together, no separate assembly to fail at the junction, and he would cover the spruce poles with hand-split cedar shakes first, then pack 8 inches of moss across the entire surface, then cut and lay 6 inches of sod for top. The living moss and clay root mat would knit together within weeks. The roof would become, in effect, a continuous insulating mat, organic, flexible, nearly windproof. The floor would be rough-sawn planks over log joists set on a gravel pad. Not earth, not stone. Planks, with the stove's warmth moving through them freely. And the stove. That was the calculation he had run most carefully. He had purchased the cast-iron box stove in Skagway, a standard unit of the kind sold to every prospector heading north. What was not standard was the pipe arrangement he had designed around it. 6-inch diameter cast iron, 8 feet of horizontal run across the width of the cabin before angling up and out through the roof. The horizontal section would be supported on 2 wrought iron brackets he had forged himself from rod stock on a borrowed hearth in Skagway. Every foot of that horizontal run would radiate heat into the living space, rather than sending it straight up the chimney to the empty sky. He had read about this principle in a pamphlet on Scandinavian farmhouse heating, translated into Norwegian, that a librarian in Bergen had tracked down for him 6 weeks before he left. He had cross-referenced it against his own experience fitting the galley stoves of Arctic route vessels, where the ship's carpenters learned early that a long horizontal flue run in a confined space could heat a hold that a short vertical stack left freezing, and the horizontal pipe slowed the draft. Slower draft meant more heat transferred to the pipe walls. More heat to the pipe walls meant more heat radiated into the room. The principle was not new. The principle was simply not applied here, in this camp, by these men. Halvorsen was still squatting at the edge of the site. "The pipe," Einar said, without looking up. 8 feet of cast iron at 6 inches diameter, running horizontal across the cabin at chest height before it exits. Cast iron holds and radiates heat well. Any blacksmith knows that. When the stove is burning, the full length of that pipe is warm, not just the firebox. 8 feet of radiating surface, the length of the room. He drove a trunnel. I burn the stove for 2, maybe 3 hours in the evening. The pipe gives the heat back slowly after I bank the fire. I do not tend the fire at midnight. I do not wake at 3 in the morning to feed it. I sleep. Calthorpe had gone quiet. Halvorsen sat down on the frozen ground and did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "You designed that pipe run before you left Norway?" "On the riverboat coming north," Einar said. "The arithmetic is not complicated. The idea is not new. The only thing new is doing it here, in front of men who think I am building a decorative spruce skeleton for my family to freeze inside." He tapped another trunnel home. The cold pressed against his back. Above the ridge to the northwest, the sky had darkened another shade, the color of a bruise going deep. The first storm was maybe 2 days out, maybe 1. He had shakes to split, moss to pack, sod to cut and lay, and a pipe to hang before it arrived. He kept working, yet the frame stood complete by the end of the first day. Einar worked from first light, his breath coming in short, hard bursts in the still air, each exhale hanging in front of his face for a moment before the cold dissolved it. He had notched the main rafters the day before. Now he set the secondary poles across them at 16-inch spacing, lashing each one with rawhide cord that he had soaked overnight so it would shrink taut as it dried, pulling the whole assembly into a single rigid surface. Britta held the end of each pole while he lashed, the two of them moving without words through a set of tasks they had divided between themselves on the riverboat, in the same practical silence they had used to raise their daughters and run their household in Stavanger. The blows of the mallet came out flat and dense in the cold air, at the sound carrying across the camp with a dull authority that brought men out of their tents to watch. They watched the way men watch something they expect to fail. Creed Halvorsen stood at the edge of his own camp with a tin cup of coffee, not speaking. Rudd Calthorpe leaned against a spruce trunk with his arms crossed. 3 other men whose names Einar had not yet learned squatted on their heels near the creek bank, observing with the patient, slightly hungry attention of people waiting for an accident. Hannah kept her sister Kirsten back from the work site, the 2 girls pressed together under a single blanket on top of the supply crates, watching their father with identical pale eyes. By noon, the shakes were going on. Einar had split them himself from a cedar log he had felled and hauled up from the creek bottom, but using a froe and a wooden club, the splits coming clean along the grain in long tapered wedges 6 inches wide. He nailed them to the pole surface with cut nails, overlapping each course by 2 inches, working from the bottom edge upward, so each row shed water down over the course below. It was the same logic as planking a hull. Water, or snowmelt, followed gravity. You arranged your surfaces to agree with it. The moss went on in the afternoon, Hannah and Kirsten helping carry it in armloads from the forest floor, where it grew thick against the north bases of the spruce trunks. Einar packed it 8 inches deep across the entire shake surface, pressing it into every gap, into every seam, into every imperfection the split cedar had left. Moss in a compressed mat acts as a natural insulating barrier, and 8 inches of packed moss laid over a solid shake surface would stop most of the wind's ability to move heat out through the roof. Then the sod. He had cut it the day before with a spade and a handsaw from a meadow clearing 50 yards south, slicing the turf into blocks 12 inches square, each one heavy with clay and root mat. He and Britta laid them across the moss in offset courses, the way a mason lays brick, each block overlapping the seam of the course below. 6 inches of sod over 8 inches of moss over hand-split cedar shakes over a solid spruce pole frame. Calthorpe walked over when Einar was laying the last sod course at the ridge. He stood and looked at the green-brown surface of the finished roof. "That is going to be heavy," he said. Einar pressed the last block flat. Yes. Heavy enough to collapse the frame in a wet spring. The frame is notched and trunneled at the peak. Pegged timber, no nails at the joints. It will carry twice this load. He climbed down from the short ladder and stepped back to look at the full structure. In January, when the snow packs against it, it will carry 3 times this load. That weight is insulation I did not have to buy, or split, or haul. Calthorpe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cabin at the east end used cut logs, chinked with moss and clay. That is what men build here." "I know what men build here." Einar picked up the mallet. "I built this." Calthorpe walked back to his camp without another word. The stove went in last, as the light was failing. Einar had set the log sill foundation on a gravel pad that morning, of 3 courses of notched logs to lift the structure off the frozen ground and give the floor joists clearance. The plank floor went across the joists at midday, rough-sawn spruce, 1 inch thick, fitted tight. No gaps in this floor. The warmth would come from the stove and the pipe, not from the ground below. Different principle from what he had used in other builds. This cabin would be heated from above the floor, not through it. The air would warm first. The floor would follow. The cast-iron box stove sat centered on a flat hearthstone near the north wall. From its top collar, the pipe ran horizontally, east to west, supported at each bracket. 8 feet of 6-inch cast iron at chest height before it turned 90 degrees and angled up through a tin-collared hole in the south wall near the peak. And he sealed the collar with a clay and sand mortar he had mixed in a tin pail, pressing it into the gap between the pipe and the wood with a stick, smoothing it flush. He lit the stove with a handful of dry spruce shavings and 4 sticks of split wood and let it burn at full draw for 30 minutes, heating the firebox and the full pipe run to working temperature, driving out any residual moisture before he reduced the draft to a steady, controlled burn. The stove was not large, deliberately not large. A large stove burns hot and fast and demands cold outside air to feed its draft, pulling that air through every gap in the structure. A small stove, properly managed, burns long and steady and asks less of the space around it. Within an hour, the horizontal pipe was radiating warmth along its entire length. Einar walked the interior slowly, and holding his bare hand 6 inches from the pipe at various points along the run. Warm at the firebox end, warm at the midpoint, noticeably warm still at the far end, where the pipe turned to exit. 8 feet of radiant surface. The heat moved outward from the pipe in all directions, toward the walls, toward the floor, toward the bunks along the south side, rather than rising directly to the roof peak and exhausting through the chimney. Interior temperature that first night held at 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it dropped to 23 below. The girls slept under 2 wool blankets on a pine bough mattress laid directly on the plank floor near the south wall. Britta sat beside the banked stove with a cup of tea that did not cool quickly because the air around it was not cold enough to steal the heat fast. Einar sat with his pipe-run calculations on his knee and his pencil moving, recording the numbers. He had known the design would work. Knowing and measuring were different things. He measured because he wanted the numbers to exist for whoever came after him. Halvorsen came by the next morning. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the entrance flap with ice in his beard and the look of a man who had not slept comfortably, which he had not. His elevated tent had required feeding the stove every 90 minutes through the night just to hold the interior above freezing. He had checked his platform at 3 in the morning and found frost on the inside of the canvas walls, frost on his spare boots, a frost on the rim of his water bucket 12 inches from the stove. He ducked through the entrance of Einar's cabin and stood inside for a moment without speaking. The air was not warm in the way a roaring fire makes a room warm, scorching at the face and frigid at the feet, creating violent currents that chill more than they comfort. It was simply and completely not cold. An even, settled, surrounding not cold that had no drafts and no hot spots and no source you could point to, because the source was everywhere. The stove was barely glowing, its draft nearly closed, but the pipe above it was still giving off warmth, still radiating from the full 8-foot run, and still paying back the 2 hours of burning from the night before. He put his hand near the midpoint of the pipe. He held it there. "The whole pipe," he said. "Yes," Einar said. Halvorsen straightened up and looked at the stove, barely glowing, the draft almost fully closed. He looked at the sod ceiling above him, low and solid, no condensation visible on the shakes beneath it. He looked at the 2 girls eating a breakfast of oat porridge without their coats on, their movements easy and unrushed, nothing in their posture that suggested they were cold, because they were not cold. "How much wood last night?" he said. It was not quite a question. Einar held up 4 fingers, 4 pieces of split spruce, burned over 2 hours in the evening. At a conventional elevated tent, in those same overnight temperatures, would have burned through 40 pieces or more to achieve a lesser result. Halvorsen sat down on a supply crate. He sat there for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest, a thin, sharp wind with nothing polite about it, and it moved over the top of the A-frame and kept moving, sliding off the steep, sod-covered sides without purchase, finding no flat canvas to strip, no platform to scour from below, no seams to work it methodically through the night. The cabin did not shudder. It did not creak. It simply sat inside its own mass and let the wind divide around it. "When does the real cold come?" Hannah asked from her blanket. Halvorsen looked at her. Then he looked at Einar. "January," he said. "Maybe late December if we are unlucky." Hannah nodded and went back to her porridge. 3 weeks later, on the last day of October, a trapper coming south from the 70-mile river country stopped at the 40-mile camp for a single night. He had a dog team and a sled, and the face of a man who had spent too many winters out in the open to be surprised by anything. He walked the camp at dusk, cataloging each shelter the way a professional catalogs inventory. He looked at Halvorsen's elevated tent platform. He looked at Calthorpe's reinforced wall tent, staked to the surface with a pyramid of guy wires. He looked at 2 log frame structures going up at the east end of camp, their walls still gapped and unchinked, nowhere near ready for serious cold. Then he stopped in front of Einar's A-frame and looked at the steep sod-covered sides. As the low roof line barely 4 feet off the ground at the eaves, the thin curl of stove smoke rising straight up in the still evening air, the warm amber light that leaked from the gap under the entrance flap and lay across the frozen ground outside in a thin blade. He stood there for a full minute. Then he stepped through the entrance without asking permission, which was the frontier way of saying, the question was too important for manners. He pressed his palm against the south wall at chest height and felt the solid resistance of sod. Over moss, over shakes, over timber. He straightened and looked at the horizontal pipe running the width of the cabin, held on its brackets above head height. He put his hand near its midpoint, 6 inches out, and held it there. He looked at the stove, barely burning. It draft, almost closed. He looked at Einar. "Seen something like this once," he said. "Nordic settler, upper porcupine country. Low roof, thick walls, long flue, run inside before the chimney went out. I thought it was old country habit." He looked at the pipe again. It was not habit. He climbed back out and ate his supper and left before dawn. He did not say another word about the cabin. He did not need to. The real cold was still coming. January came without warning. The barometer above Calthorpe's tent dropped 4 points in 2 hours on the morning of January 3rd. By noon, the sky had sealed itself flat and white. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind arrived from the northwest at a sustained 40 miles per hour, and the temperature fell through -40 and kept falling. It fell to -62 by nightfall. Then further. In the 40-mile camp, the sound of the storm was a physical thing. It pressed against log walls and found the gaps. It drove granular snow through canvas seams and deposited frost on the inside faces of every surface tent in the camp. Calthorpe fed his stove through the night without sleeping, burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply before February. Halvorsen, who had reinforced his platform tent with banked snow walls after watching Einar work through October, held his interior at 19 degrees Fahrenheit and considered that a victory. In the A-frame, Einar lit the stove at 4 in the afternoon and burned it for 3 hours. Then he banked the fire to coals and let the pipe take over. Interior temperature at midnight was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was -67. The snow buried the cabin completely by the second day, which Einar had anticipated. 3 feet of packed snow pressed against the sod walls and over the sod roof, adding a final layer of insulation that no amount of burning wood could have replicated. The steep sides of the A-frame had shed the first rush of snow cleanly, then collected and held the secondary accumulation. Against its flanks like a man pulling a coat closed, the wind screamed over the buried roofline and found nothing to grip. The entrance was drifted shut and had to be tunneled open from inside, which Einar did with a grain scoop and the satisfaction of a man whose design had performed exactly as calculated. Kirsten slept through the worst of it. All 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. Halvorsen helped dig them out, pulling snow away from the entrance tunnel until the light came in, and Einar stepped out into a world scoured clean and brilliant and brutally cold. His woodpile was barely touched. Halvorsen looked at it for a long time without speaking. Calthorpe came over an hour later. He stood in front of the cabin and looked at the sod roof, still intact, the packed snow sitting against the steep sides exactly as Einar had described it would. He looked at the horizontal pipe where it exited through the wall, a thin column of vapor still rising from its end. He looked at Einar's daughters eating breakfast through the open entrance flap in their shirt sleeves. He pulled out a notebook and a pencil stub. "Show me the measurements," he said. "All of them." Einar showed him. Every number from every night of the winter, recorded in the same hand that had done the calculations on the riverboat coming north. Temperature inside, temperature outside, wood consumed, hours burned, pipe diameter, pipe run length, bracket spacing, sod depth, moss depth, shake, coarse overlap. Calthorpe copied it all without comment. By spring, 4 more A-frame structures had gone up along the Fortymile. None of them were identical to Einar's. Each man adapted the principle to his own materials, his own ground, his own family's size. But the core held in every one. Shed the snow, let it accumulate against your walls. Run your pipe long before it exits. Heat only what the fire cannot avoid heating. Einar never filed a patent. He never wrote it up for a mining journal. He recorded his numbers, shared them with anyone who asked. Johan went back to work on his claim. The ground had kept his family alive. The least he could do was keep digging it. If Einar's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have built that A-frame in frozen ground with winter 2 days out? Or would you have taken the safer option and raised a standard tent like every other man in camp? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.